Hi students, welcome to my module on trauma, memory and the law. This mini lecture will be on the history of this topic before 1980, and the other mini lecture this week will be on history after 1980. But before I start, I want to first explain how I am teaching this module with a focus on the type of traumatic memory cases that are most relevant to the law, and the most controversial ones too, and those are that involve repressed memory cases that are most often called nowadays dissociative amnesia cases, and especially those cases that involve possible false beliefs and memories that lead to false convictions. It creates a curiosity to look at the research on how memory works, which is what we also cover in this module too. So let's explain the history of this topic with this focus on recovered memories before 1980. First, what did ancient civilizations think about trauma and memory? There are some writings about trauma and conditions akin to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in ancient Greece. Even the word trauma itself comes from a Greek word, travma, approximately. It's spelled differently than it sounds, which originally meant a wound, and that's the origins of the word, presumably describing a physical trauma initially, and the definition has expanded to include psychological trauma more recently. Now, modern scholars have looked back at ancient writings looking for evidence of trauma or PTSD, and here is a kind of thing that they have found. Around 500 BC, for example, Georgius of Leontini in Sicily wrote about war and the effects of fear on Greek soldiers in his work called Encomium of Helen, 16 to 17. And here is what he wrote. And some people before now, on seeing frightful things in war, have also lost their presence of mind in the present moment. Fear so extinguishes and expels thought, and many have fallen into groundless distress and terrible illness and incurable madness. So deeply does sight engrave on the mind images of actions that are seen. So back in ancient Greece, some soldiers did seem to be suffering from the after effects of what they had seen in war, which is perhaps some evidence that post-traumatic stress is not confined to one culture or one time period. Maybe it's a universal human thing. On the other hand, evidence that trauma is repressed or dissociated, which is a modern idea, is harder to find in ancient literature. Specifically, I'm talking about repressed memories, which are traumatic memories that are completely blocked from consciousness, such that the person does not even know the trauma even happened. Now, Harrison Pope and colleagues in their 2007 paper posed a challenge to scholars to find evidence of dissociative amnesia before the modern era, for example, before the 18th century approximately. And when nobody could find such evidence, they hypothesized that selective dissociative amnesia might therefore be a culture-bound syndrome. In other words, not a naturally occurring phenomena in all humans, in all cultures, and in all time frames, but one affected by culture, social aspects, social contagion, and folklore, especially affected by Freud's ideas in Western Europe specifically in that time period. So the question is, did Freud discover repressed memories in the 1890s, or did he incorrectly create false folklore about repression? Think about that as we go through the course. Instead of me giving my opinion, I'll instead explain the history of the idea of traumatic repression before what came before Freud and what influenced him, and then after Freud in this lecture. Let me first set the scene of the world before Freud. We had the Enlightenment in Europe that developed the idea that there was such a thing as objective truth, and that rationality is the best way to get closer to that truth through both rationalism and empiricism. And we also had the idea that subjective experience might not be the best way to find that objective truth. But there was also a backlash to that rational approach during the Romantic period of the 19th century that followed the Enlightenment, which emphasized that emotion and subjectivity as being just as valuable as the new rationality that came from the Enlightenment. You could argue that the fight between those that value objective truth and those who value subjective truth continues today, on Twitter perhaps. Indeed, the battle between objective and subjective truth can be traced back to Franz Mesmer's work in 1779 on mesmerism, animal magnetism, and trance. The ideas were very much reliant on subjective truth reported by his patients and his whole own subjective ideas. And that clashed with the more objective opposition to mesmerism from people like Benjamin Franklin, who was part of the Royal Commission in 1784 that effectively debunked mesmerism and saw it as a fake science, what we now would call a pseudoscience. Nevertheless, over the next 100 years, mesmerism and trance work evolved into hypnosis, which led to the establishment in the 1860s to the 1890s of two hypnosis schools in Paris. Now, one was called the Nancy School, and the other one was called the Paris School of Hypnosis. Both of them were in Paris, but one was called Nancy, one was called Paris. Both of which Freud visited before coming up with his theories of trauma and repression. In the years before those Nancy and Paris schools, hypnosis had gradually developed the idea that time can be lost during hypnosis, and then the idea that there may be a connection between trauma, hypnosis, suggestion, and dissociation started to be developed, and also the idea that time can be lost from traumatic experiences itself. In other words, traumatic experiences can be blocked out. It all came from this development of hypnosis. In the Nancy School, Freud learned from Hippolyte Bernheim, a physician hypnotist who tended to emphasize suggestibility in hypnosis, and Freud translated a couple of Bernheim's books. The Paris School, also called the Salpêtrière School, was antagonistic to the Nancy School, because in the Paris School they tended to believe in the patient's reports of their hysteria, where hysteria was a catch-all category that included somatic problems and emotional instability. For example, Jean-Martin Charcot believed that hysteria was caused by trauma and believed that hypnosis could be used to probe such cases. Pierre Janet, also of the Paris School, developed the idea that trauma can lead to dissociation or fragmentation, and that neurosis was caused by a failure to integrate past trauma. And Freud learned from both of those, directly from Charcot and Janet in the Paris schools. Now notice all these ideas stemmed from subjective reports from patients in combination with subjectively derived theories from their physician hypnotists. A similar way of discovering the truth as the past 100 years of mesmerism that came before that time, right? And the question is this branch of subjectiveness in psychology still around today? In 1893, Freud and his colleague Breuer formulated the idea of repressed memories, that traumas can be so threatening to the system that they can be immediately and unconsciously blocked, such that the person does not even know that they were traumatized, that the blocked trauma caused symptoms while blocked, and that they may be able to recall the trauma with therapists for a fee to cure their symptoms. His theory also introduced the idea of catharsis, the idea that the emotional part of the memory needs to be relived and released to relieve the pent-up emotions. And now this is the hydraulic model of emotions that sees emotions as a substance that builds up, and modern emotion research puts these ideas into doubt. Since Freud, the idea of repressed memories persisted. For example, in 1906, Morton Prince stretched the theory even more to include the idea that severe trauma might lead to such severe dissociation that the patient develops multiple personalities. This idea stuck in psychiatric folklore too. In 1924, Otto Rank wrote about how birth itself may be a trauma especially important in neurosis. In 1950, L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology fame wrote about people regressing their memories to birth and even conception. In 1970, Dr. Arthur Janov reformed early Freudian ideas to reboot the idea that early experiences are repressed and should be relived in therapy. Given what we know about the natural tendency of infantile amnesia, it appears that Freud's ideas of unconscious repression may have contributed to false recall in all of these examples. Indeed, Freud's ideas were born in therapies that recalled other false memories too, such as past life memories, as documented by de Rocas, 1911, documenting regressing a patient into past lives. Also in Bernstein's 1952 book about the Bridie Murphy story, where regression memories were recovered in a series of past lives. So these Freudian ideas of repression have also led to memories of alien abduction, again false memories I would assume, such as Fuller's 1966 story of using hypnotherapy on a couple who subsequently recalled a trip in a spaceship in which they were examined by strange alien creatures. So the idea of Freudian repression did continue to influence some hypnotists and some therapists in the years that followed Freud up until 1980. And to learn more about that, you can check out my Patius and Jungis 2015 paper on false memories before 1980. Now, as you will see in the next mini lecture, Freud's ideas were utilized again in the 1980s in a whole new way. See you next time.